Hello, this is a video for the module TMM2051 New Testament Studies, and this term in the second half of the module we're looking at the Apostle Paul. This video is for week 9, and in week 9 we're considering ritual meals as part of the issues section of our curriculum, and we're looking at the Lord's Supper. Now, there are two passages that are relevant to the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians. The first is chapter 10, verses 14 to 22, and the second is chapter 11, verses 17 to the end. And we're looking in this video at chapter 10. So I'm going to put chapter 10 on the screen for you. And here we are. There it is. It's in the NRSV version. And I'm just going to quickly read it through and give you an overview of the issues that might be attached to interpreting it. Therefore, my dear friends, flee from the worship of idols. I speak to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a sharing in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a sharing in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifice as partners in the altar? What do I imply then? That food sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Or are we provoking the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? So let's briefly consider some of the background. And first, it's important to situate this passage in its context in the epistle. And I wonder if you can remember from week 1, when we did a brief overview of the contents of 1 Corinthians, that from chapters 8 through to the end of chapter 10, Paul is addressing in an extended kind of sandwich format idol food, particularly sacrificial foods, and is it okay for Christians to eat them? And so let's briefly set the scene. So we'll go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 8. So I'll just put that in there. 1 Corinthians 8. So here we are. Food offered to idols, and we can tell that this is beginning a new section because Paul begins it now concerning food sacrificed to idols. And whenever he says now concerning in 1 Corinthians, it usually marks a change of subject. And so this entire section is about food offered to idols. And it's a complicated question because there's the question of, is it okay to eat the food itself? You know, does sacrificing food to an idol render it non-comestible to Christians? And then there's also the question of where are we permitted to eat this food, if we are permitted to eat it? And those two issues aren't the same. And we can see in chapter 8 that the issue is that there's some Corinthians who believe that it's okay to eat idol food because, verse 4, there is no idol in the world. So there might be objects called idols, but the realities that lie behind them or in them are not God. And there is no God but one. So in other words, a kind of strict monotheism would reveal that idols are things, fond things vainly invented, or is it vain things fondly invented? Anyway, the point is that at least part of the Corinthians believe that the knowledge that there is only one God and the knowledge that we are free in the Spirit of Christ means that there are no things in the world that are just tainted to the touch. And therefore it's okay to eat. All things have been declared clean. But Paul says, not everybody, verse 7, has this knowledge. Some have been accustomed to idols, and so they think of the food that they eat as food offered to an idol, and because they think idols are wrong, that there's a reality, there's a tainting reality behind the idol. They can't eat in freedom, and rather eat to the staining of their own conscience. This, he argues, is kind of both a subjective thing and an objective thing. Food itself objectively won't bring us close to God. We're no worse off if we miss out, and we're no better off if we eat it. But this liberty will be a stumbling block to the weak if they see Christians doing things that they believe to be wrong. And so Paul seems to be arguing that to the strong, yes, your theology is right, but your practice is wrong. Your practice should be, we are strong, therefore we are going to freely expend this privilege for those who aren't as strong as we are. And Paul mentions in verse 10 that if others see you eating in the temple of an idol, might they not be encouraged to the point of eating food sacrificed to idols? So in other words, you know, we do something not in faith, and it becomes an occasion for our acting against our consciences. There's a complicated argument there about conscience, but basically Paul's point stands. Paul's point stands. There's nothing wrong with it objectively, but it's an objective problem if people subjectively do things against their conscience. He expands on this in chapter 9, which is all about the rights of an apostle and how Paul himself, on the basis of those rights, gives up those rights in order to be like Christ, in order to benefit those who are weaker than him. And the clear implication is that the Corinthians, particularly the strong Corinthians, ought to follow that example. And Paul at various points in Corinthians and elsewhere says, imitate me as I'm imitating Christ. And I think this is what he's doing in this passage. So let's scoot forward to chapter 10, verse 14. At this point, Paul has returned to the topic of idol food. Except the issue here isn't so much, is the food itself tainted? The issue here is, why shouldn't we eat it in the temple? And I think that's an important distinction to make. Why shouldn't we eat it in the temple? And his basic answer to this is because to do so would implicate you in idolatry. So idols might be a nothing in the world, but idolatry remains wrong. What does he mean by that? Well, at some level, though the realities that lie behind the idol may be not God, non-divine, they are nonetheless real realities for Paul. So, for instance, verse 20, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. So the point there is Paul has in mind this idea that even though the Gentiles worship as gods things which are not God, the things themselves are real and to be avoided. So that's perhaps the first distinction to make. The second thing is to see how he situates this passage in a wider context. And to do that, we've got to go back to the beginning of the verse, which is entitled, the section is entitled in the NRSV, Warnings from Israel's History, and that's a really good thing. A better title might have been Israel's Privileges and also Israel's Disgraces. So I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the spiritual food, and all drank the spiritual drink, for they drank from the rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. And you see there that Paul is using Jesus' movement terminology to re-describe the Exodus. So passing through the Red Sea is baptism, eating the manna and drinking the water is analogous to communion. And the analogy is quite deep because Paul seems to be indicating that the rock from which Moses drew the water was actually in some way associated with Christ. And key to this is, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, and they were struck down in the wilderness. And what follows in verses 6 through 13 is a list of the real difficulties during the wilderness wanderings in the book of Numbers in particular. And what we've got there is a litany of disgraces. And it's quite interesting because one of the things that would happen in, say, a Passover midrash is that we would, a rabbi would describe the president would describe the disgraces of Israel and then go on to the glories of the covenant. Paul has inverted that, and he's actually beginning with the great privileges of Israel, and then points out their great disgraces and how many people died in the desert. And the point there is verse 14, my dear friends, and the implication is don't be like them. Flee from the worship of idols. And that's key. That's his thesis statement for this section of the book. This section of the argument, sorry. And then he invites them to agree with him, because that's what it means when he asks the rhetorical question, I speak as to sensible people, judge for yourselves what I say, and then he poses them a series of questions. And the first question is a question about the Lord's Supper, verses 16 and 17. The second question is about the sacrifices of ancient Israel, verses 18 and 19. And then the third question is the third point is not really a question, it's Paul's conclusion from 20 onwards. And his parting shot in verse 22, are we provoking the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? Is basically an allusion to the Old Testament notion of God as a jealous God, which is a big feature of God's self-disclosure in the Exodus story and in the wilderness. That the Lord expects his people to have what's called a monolatrous commitment to him, that they will worship him and him only. So, let's have a brief look at the issues. Well, the first thing that you notice about this passage, after setting it in that context, is that Paul is referring to three distinct forms of ritual meal. The first ritual meal, the Lord's Supper, the second ritual meal, the sacrifices of Israel's altar, and the third ritual meal, the Greco-Roman cult meals that you might expect the Corinthians to have been invited to in temples, and which Paul seeks to dissuade them from attending. And want to draw your attention to a couple of things. Firstly, it isn't obvious that these meals are all the same, but it is obvious that there are certain common elements to their structure that Paul seems to be assuming. And the second thing is that there are common elements to their meaning. And that's got to be very carefully parsed. But there are common elements. What do I mean by that? Well, if we have a look at sharing, you'll notice in the little dialogue that appears here, it says are sharing, but the manuscript says koinonia. So that's quite an important term for Paul, a fellowship, a participation, a communion. Let's go to partners. Are not those who eat the sacrifices partners in the altar? And here we are, the manuscript says koinonoi, sharers, partners. It's the same basic word. It would have been perfectly, instead of saying partners in the altar, it would have been perhaps just as easy and perhaps slightly clearer if the NRSV had translated sharing in the body of Christ as participating or in the body of Christ, and if they'd translated partners in the altar as participants in the altar, and then you get the distinction: participation, participants, participation, participants, koinonia, koinonoi. Yeah? The point is that there's common terminology that Paul is using to describe the relationship between those who dine and the ritual meaning of what's happening. And let's have a look, lastly, in verse 20, partners with demons, and again, koinonus, which is the same word as koinonoi. The description of the diner in relation to the ritual meal is basically the same. If you are a koinonos, a sharer in the meal, then you have koinonia in whatever the meal is about. That's, if you're a top participant in the meal, you participate in whatever the meal is about. And so there's a relationship here between diners and the meaning of the meal. You can't insulate yourself from what you eat. And there's a profound truth here, which is that when communities eat together, they ingest, they imbibe the meaning of the community that is held by the meal. You know, eating together is a profound statement of solidarity, of fellowship, koinonia. And to eat together is to imply something about belonging to the same community. It's not just about hospitality, it's about belonging to the same community, and it's about sharing the meaning of the meal. So there's something deep going on there in the analogy between all of these three. So that's part of what's holding this argument together, these three apparently quite different sets of meals. But it's also worth looking at the meals themselves. Let's think about the second two meals, the sacrifices of Israel and the sacrifices of Greco-Roman cults. Broadly speaking, you might describe a process for an animal sacrifice in antiquity. And this is a brutal oversimplification, but nonetheless it remains useful. And what you would do is a devotee would bring an offering. The animal would be killed by the priest, possibly in one place, and then parts of the animal would be cut out and devoted to the god. And we see that in the Old Testament, that there are certain parts of the sacrifice, the nicest, juiciest, fattiest parts, that are burnt to make a pleasing aroma for God. And in fact, there are some sacrifices in the Old Testament, like the Holocaust sacrifice, where the entire animal is burnt as a sacrifice to God. But here, we simply need to think in terms of a general process. The animal is killed in one place, bits of it are offered to the god in another place. Some of it is taken for the priest, because of course the priests and their fellow workers live off the sacrifices. And then, in some texts, the family of the devotee get together in the temple of God, in the presence of God, and eat the meal along with strong drink. In other texts, like in antiquity, what's left is sold at the meat market. And so there's a common process. There's an act of killing, there's an act of offering. There might also be an act of presentation, where food is left on an altar or table of presentation in front of the deity. There are elements of this in the Old Testament where we have things like the table of the showbread for the bread of the presence, which is distinct from the altar, but it's there as a memorial offering before God. And so there are things that are sacrificed on altars, things that are presented at tables, and then there are things that are eaten at tables. And that's part of a large sacrificial process. And certainly in the Old Testament, and arguably for Paul in certain in Greco-Roman cults, the meal that follows the sacrifice is part of the larger event. It's bound to it. And it might be helpful for understanding Paul's mindset for us to remember that actually the eating and drinking in the presence of the Lord as part of the Old Testament sacrificial process was a way of saying that Israel was dining in the presence of its God. In other words, dining with the Lord. The Lord had his bit, they had their bit. And the point is, we're eating together. So it's about friendship with God. So that's part of it. And we might apply the same sort of thing to Greco-Roman cults, that actually the dining table in a temple is not insulatable from the altar. And just to give an illustration of that, there is an inscription. I forget where it is. It's either in the Kolner papyrus or the Oxyrhynchus papyrus. Not an inscription, an invitation. That recounts a dining invitation to eat at the dining room of Asclepius, the healer divinity. And the invitation takes the form, "The god invites you to dine." The point being, the god is the patron of the meal, the god is the host. And so at one level, we might interpret, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons, as a way of saying you may not have fellowship under the patronage of a demon. That at these sacrificial meals, the demons themselves are there as patrons. That might be one way of thinking about it. But either way, what you've got there is a process. You've got there a process. there's the killing of the animal, there's the sacrificing of the offering of the animal to the god, the presentation of bits before the deity, and the eating of bits in the temple dining room. And that, for Paul, is part of a larger process. Arguably, for pagans, it would be part of a larger process too. And Paul's monolatrous commitment to God precludes that. You don't eat the table of the Lord and the table of demons. That's important. So what are we going to do about the Lord's Supper? The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a sharing in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a sharing in the body of Christ? One of the remarkable things about this passage is that, and you see this in patristic writers, where they routinely describe the Lord's Supper as a bloodless sacrifice. I'm not entirely sure that Paul would have described the Lord's Supper in those terms. I think for Paul, the meal architecture, this structure of there's a death, there's an act of presentation, and then there's a meal, still holds for the Lord's Supper, but it's been distinctively modified. And I think the way that it's been modified is that the bread and the wine are proxies for the death of Christ. This is something we'll come back to in 1 Corinthians 11, but the bread and the wine are proxies for the death of Christ. And therefore, just like the other meals, the Lord's Supper has an antecedent death. Just like the meal in the dining room has an antecedent death, and just like the meal in the dining room has an antecedent sacrifice, I think Paul is assuming that the death of Christ is related in some analogous way to the Lord's Supper. And that automatically suggests that Paul is seeing the Lord's Supper as a sacrificial meal and Christ's death as a sacrificial death. You wouldn't put these meals together in that way, knowing full well that that would be one of the implications, unless that was an implication you were comfortable with. And so this automatically suggests that there is a sacrificial interpretation to the death of Jesus already. So yes, at one level, obviously the Lord's Supper is a bloodless sacrifice, but it's not a deathless sacrificial meal. That rather the body and the blood is covered by a kind of symbolic proxy. And of course, I'm using symbol not in an empty sense here to mean that Paul dissociated, as a mere sign, that Paul dissociated the bread and the wine from the death of Christ. Rather, just using it as a way of describing what it is to stand proxy. As it is, Paul in verse 17 uses deeply mystical language to describe the way in which partaking in the one bread makes us one body in the context of being body of Christ. And so to receive the one bread is to be enacted, is to receive the enaction of a profound unification. It's to be made one, and with one another and with Christ. And that's not simply a communitarian thing. There's something metaphysical going on for Paul. Now I think that's enough to be going on with. But the only remaining thing is to say that there have been lots of studies of what sort of koinonia might be at play in these meals, and broadly speaking, the model of fellowship that is proposed by scholars takes one of three forms. there's a model of fellowship which is basically horizontal, that koinonia is about fellowship with one another. Then there's a model of fellowship which is basically vertical, that the model of fellowship is fellowship together with the God. So we're eating and drinking with the Lord. But some writers have gone as far as to argue that the fellowship that is experienced, the koinonia that is experienced, is literal participation in the substance of the God. So the question is, do you eat and drink together in remembrance of your God? Do you eat and drink together in the presence of your God? Do you eat and drink your God? Those are important distinctions. There's nothing in, I personally don't think there's enough in the literature to rule any of those out. And so I've specifically said in my discussion of this passage, where it may be, I've specifically said in my discussion of this passage that that none of these are mutually exclusive, that actually Paul's understanding of the Lord's Supper may encompass one or more or all of these. So please do read my discussion of that passage. In the meantime, I think at 32 minutes I've given you enough on this particular passage, and so I'm going to draw a close there and say I hope you enjoy reading 1 Corinthians 10, 14 to 22. So thank you for tuning in. I'll also be posting a video about 1 Corinthians 11:17 to the end.